Hi. So I just want to preface this by saying that I'm not attempting to share this experience to convince anyone of anything. I'm just sharing my personal experience, mostly because I need to do so to continue with my healing. So I wrote something that I wanted to read, which is what's happening. I have been trying to post this all day and it's just not been working. So anyway, just heads up, if this is not what you're wanting to watch, because it's live now, I would recommend signing up. Okay, so these last few months have fostered a lot of noticing. Not really the romantic kind of noticing like meditation, but like the daily dirty kind. And at first, this noticing was really necessary for self-preservation because despite my best efforts, ironically, I had allowed myself to barnacle to an excessively naturalistic idea of pregnancy and delivery and motherhood that eventually led me to both a very dangerous place physically and psychologically. So I'll get into the details of that later. But what I've been thinking about as I've been slowly emerging from a period of extended fear and general mistrust is the concept of health, the sale of health, and just how the ego can get so tied up in conception and pregnancy, delivery, motherhood, specifically. In all this noticing, I've also become aware of an overuse and a fluffing, or when I'm feeling my most frustrated, a co-opting of the term, quote unquote, listen to your body. What I've learned in this experience of traumatic birth and traumatic postpartum is that listening to your body does not always mean ignoring allopathic medical advice. I feel like that's what it means when people say it. Is just that your body will naturally heal itself and that you can manifest that. And sometimes that might be true, and sometimes it might not be true. In fact, for me, the consistent anxiety, obsession, and fear that I was feeling in the last 2 trimesters of my pregnancy was actually not me being a hypochondriac, and was not me refusing to surrender to the experience, but was actually my intuition telling me something was terribly, terribly wrong. My obsession with looking up preeclampsia in the wee hours of the night, and my need to always be taking my pulse, my complete tearful breakdown in the middle of a Rite Aid pharmacy when my blood pressure read 145/95 in like my 4th or 5th month of gestation. The obsession with the swelling in my legs and my hands and my feet that felt very abnormal to me, despite being told that I was healthy and that this is completely normal. My continuous telling to my midwife that I was fearful that she would fire me, quote unquote, as a client, and that I would accidentally die in the midst of childbirth at home because I didn't want to go to a hospital. And she just assured me I needed to relax. My fearful, tearful obsession with listening to my baby's heart rate is another one because I didn't think she was moving enough. If I had listened to my body, and if my midwife had listened to my body, then all of us would have heard that I was actually not a good candidate anymore for home birth, and I should have been referred to an OB for a hospital birth planned. But instead, she recommended I take passion flower extract rather than sending me to the OB, rather than referring me out, telling me that everything was fine and I just needed to calm down and start to create affirmations for my birth plan. So, in the end, I did end up going to the hospital. Originally, I went to the hospital because I wanted an epidural. But when I got to the hospital, it became very clear that I had undiagnosed preeclampsia, among other things, which I'll get into. So I had seizure level, stroke level, high blood pressure, undiagnosed preeclampsia. I had a prolapsed cord. I had an infected uterus, and I had a baby who was born underweight for her gestation age, which was 41 weeks, likely indicating that there was some issue with my uterus. So, like I said, I went to the hospital originally just to get an epidural. After 3 days of labor, the third day ending in excruciating back labor, where I really wasn't dilating much, and I was exhausted. My blood pressure had been taken at home 3 times total in those 3 days, because if my blood pressure had been above a certain number, I would have had to go to the hospital. And so I was asked, do you want me to take your blood pressure anymore? I don't really think that that is a helpful thing to put on someone in that kind of situation. But nonetheless, by the time we got to the hospital, my blood pressure was 213 over 113, which, like I mentioned, is stroke and seizure level numbers. They couldn't even give me an epidural at first because they had to bring my blood pressure down. So I was given IV blood pressure medication. And then eventually I was given the epidural, which was when the OB discovered the prolapse. So, all that said, my baby was born underweight for her gestation age. Like I said, it was 5.8 pounds in 41 weeks. There was the prolapse, there was the infected placenta, and it's likely she wasn't moving or growing as she should have been. And I sensed that, and I was told instead by everybody to relax. Despite my best efforts as I was reading these home birthing books, I felt a really strange emotional attachment to birthing at home. As if by doing so, it would prove something about me, my worth, my health, my practice. I continued to tell myself to be mindful and to not get attached, and to remember that even though these books seem to villainize the hospital, it would not be in my best interest to become so cynical. And I should have been aware that I was starting to keep this shared language on the tip of my tongue in defensive talking points like cascade of interventions. Anybody ever heard that? The bottom line is that because I neglected to advocate for myself and listen to my body, and because my midwife did the same, and because I seemed healthy enough despite the fact that I was 39, my baby and I almost died. Each of us spent a week in the hospital. Our entire birth plan was completely abandoned. I had been so precious with things like the heel prick and the vitamin K vaccine that now my daughter is on a ventilator. She has tubes in her mouth, tubes in her wrists, in her navel, something's wrapped around her foot, so really, who even cares? Now the mission was just simply to save her. She had inhaled so much meconium, we heard someone in the surgery room say he's never seen anyone who's inhaled so much meconium before on a baby who was 5 pounds, 8 ounces. She had an infection from my placenta, so now she needs IV antibiotics. We actually both had an infection from my placenta. She was tiny. Her color was very poor. I was on magnesium sulfate to prevent seizures and strokes 2 times because my blood pressure was continuously that unstable. I felt anxious and scared and hopeless that there would never, ever, ever be some medication that I could take that would work. I had memorized the sound of the blood pressure machine. I knew what a high reading would sound like just as the cuff was filling. I was terrified of dying. I felt it very close during that emergency cesarean. That week in the hospital, I also felt it very close, both for me and my baby, and especially for myself for a few months at home. My husband felt it too. In surgery, he watched my body convulse, vomit, cry, and he watched as they pulled our teeny green baby out of my body. He peered into my uterus and he saw that it was completely filled with meconium. He couldn't look at our daughter because he was afraid he would lose me, and her, and so he chose to focus on myself. He wasn't crying just simply because I begged him not to, because it made death feel a lot closer when he did. I couldn't see my baby for a few days. I was afraid to see my baby for a few days after that. I was limp from the mag, or the magnesium. Mag is what they call it in the hospital. And I was really afraid to hold her. She was so small. My husband had to hold the breast pumps to my chest as the hospital taught us to pump, as they encouraged me to still learn how to breastfeed. The hospital loved our daughter. They held her when we couldn't. They updated us regularly. They invited us up at all hours of the night to sit with her, to try and feed her, to talk to her. They fed her donated breast milk. They never once pushed formula on us. They always asked our permission. They always kept us informed. And they were even trying to attend to our birth plan, even when all hell had already gone, or all hell had already broken loose. The OB fought for a vaginal birth with me until it was absolutely impossible. Despite the prolapse, despite the preeclampsia, she gave me 6 hours while the nurses rocked my body side to side every time that our daughter's heart rate dropped, just to look for a stable position. And it was actually the meconium that made us go into the emergency cesarean mode. Otherwise, potentially I could have had a vaginal birth like I had hoped. At one point, the NICU doctor came down into my room and sat down to tell us what was going on, but also to thank us for coming in when we did. I know what he was really saying. He was very kind to communicate it that way, with a true thank you and no judgment, because I was completely racked with guilt. My preferences almost killed us. I did not listen to my body, and I did not advocate for myself, and I allowed myself to be brainwashed into believing that a good birth and a good chance at life for my beloved baby only meant an interventionless home birth type. The language of birth is just so fraught with judgment. Natural birth means vaginal only. What is that? Natural births also result in death of the mother. They also result in death of the children. This is something that doctors I was seeing after we got out of the hospital continuously reminded me, I think to kind of cheer me up, but they kept asking, remember, what if it was 100 years ago when you would both be dead, is essentially what they're saying. But besides, isn't everything that exists on this earth actually natural? What are we saying with language like that? How is it helpful? Unmedicated feels like a medal of honor. It feels like a promise that the baby will have the healthiest life, and I really believed that. And it might be true, but also being alive is health sometimes. And of course, birth trauma doesn't end after birth. My anxiety about being on any medication during the pregnancy put me in a position to be on more medication than I have ever been on in my entire life in the last 5 months. Finally, luckily, we found medication that worked, but I had to take them 2 times per day, and I was afraid of forgetting, and I was afraid of taking too many by accident. I wanted to come off them so badly, and I was also so afraid to come off them. I had anxiety about taking my blood pressure. A bad reading, quote unquote, could destroy my day, flinging me back into the PTSD of the hospital, of the magnesium, of all the memories that were really just so close. I was afraid to be alone with my baby in case I dropped dead because of a stroke or a seizure. I was afraid to exercise because I was afraid of the feeling of my heart rate going up. I was afraid to go on walks too far away from home for the same reasons. I was afraid to drive. I was afraid just in general. Any change in my pulse would spun me into physical tremors and intense anxiety. I was afraid of the night because that is when my blood pressure would do its thing in the hospital. It was the most unstable, and that's usually when I ended up on the magnesium sulfate again. For recovery, I had the best team. I had 2 different therapists simultaneously, an incredible OBGYN, a lactation consultant who was also an RN, a pediatrician, a general practitioner, who was a DO. And even as I learned that I could trust my body and I could trust that it could hold me and it could hold my soul, that I could work through the fear, it was really hard. Even as death has felt further away, the shadow has felt very close. I feel afraid of my spiritual practices sometimes. I avoid my altar. I was afraid to chant. I led a kirtan a few weeks ago, and afterwards I felt very creepy, like a very creepy feeling, like as if I had insulted someone, and that's how I got into this position. All the things that I leaned on in my pregnancy created fear in me now, or fear for me now. It has taken me over 4 months to get to the point where I am aware of what is likely real and what is likely in my head. It has taken this long because flashbacks and memory have been very intense. Sometimes just telling the story makes my skin crawl, makes me feel afraid. It brings everything back. It's also taken me this long because for 7 months of my 41-week pregnancy, I felt something was wrong with my body and I was encouraged to ignore it. This is also really complicated because I'm a holistic practitioner. Honestly, as I was leaving the hospital, I thought about quitting. Like, is this even responsible? Because the experience I had was not responsible. I do believe in Ayurveda, though, and I do believe in holistic approaches. But I also see there's identity politics there. There's cynicism, there's mistrust, and it's warranted, of course. Allopathy and hospitals are really complicated places, but so is the home, and so is the tub. Nothing is black and white. That's been the recurrent lesson for me. And I need to remember that if it ever seems like it is, that these are the colors of my bias, and I should be aware of what I'm doing and choosing. I also know that if I am really going to embrace yoga and Ayurveda and lean into their teachings that have held me for over 20 years, that these tantras do not mean natural to just be natural. That natural is the tantric ability to alchemize all of material reality as it is and deal with it as it is, to not create favoritism of certain variations of this material reality and ignore what's actually happening. Health is not static. It cannot be had. It cannot be owned. It fluctuates. It exists on a spectrum, and it's relative. Yes, I was healthy, and also I was very much not healthy. There's no such thing as being healthy, though there are things we can do to align with health. And I am learning for myself that that conundrum is the practice. I'm learning that again and again. So thank you very much for those of you who are still listening. See you around.